I'm Jim Collison and live from the Gallup studios here in Omaha, Nebraska. This is Gallup's Called to Coach, Season 5, Episode 23, recorded on June 30th, 2017. Called to Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. If you have questions during this webcast, we do have a live chat room. It's available for you right down there, right below the main video window as you look down there. Bottom left-hand corner is a login button. Just choose that. Choose the guest account, and then put your name in where it says guest. Take those numbers out. Then hit submit. You don't need to create an account. It'll just throw you right into the chat room. We will be taking questions live. If you're joining us live, if you haven't ever watched one of these videos, you can catch us all the webcasts that are coming up off our Eventbrite page. So go to gallup.eventbrite.com. If you have questions after this webcast, or maybe you've been watching the recorded version, you can send those to us in an email. Send them to coaching@gallup.com or use the contact form right there on the live page. Don't forget to visit the Gallup Strengths Center, just gallupstrengthscenter.com, for all your Clifton Strengths coaching resources and training needs. And you can now catch the video and now streaming and downloadable audio and video for offline listening if you'd like to do that. All that's available at our coaches blog, and that might be a site you just might want to bookmark because there's a lot of great information for you and some great changes coming to it as well. You can find that over at coaching.gallup.com. Jillian Anderson is our host today. She works as a senior change and development consultant, which is a great job title. Jillian, thanks for joining us on your first Call to Coach, and welcome.
You bet. Well, thank you, Jim. It's great to join you. I'm excited to be a part of Call to Coach. And, I got to say, this is a fantastic way to spend a Friday before a holiday weekend. So I hope that for others who are joining live, this is a peak experience in your day. And for those of you who are joining on a recording later on, we're glad to have you here. Personally, as Jim mentioned, I'm based out of our Gallup Chicago office. I've been here for 9 years, and I have the privilege of working with our clients around change and development work. And today I'm really, really excited to get to host one of the organizations I've had the privilege of working with this past year, and an individual who I've gotten to know. And I just have to say, for this Call to Coach, we are in for a heartwarming, a thoughtful, an inspirational conversation. We have Jack Wilson with us, who is with Compassion International. And Jack is a senior leadership and engagement consultant there. I know you've been with Compassion for over 20 years in a variety of different HR roles. So in just a minute, Jack, we'll have you share just a little bit more about what you actually do within Compassion. But for those who are listening in, who are maybe not familiar with Compassion International, it is a global nonprofit, faith-based organization that works around the world with a simple mission, and that is to release children from poverty in Jesus' name. And so I know personally, I actually first heard about Compassion when I was in college. I went to a Jars of Clay concert and heard them talking about just this opportunity to sponsor a child and to get to help with global child poverty from a Christian perspective. And Jim, I know you and your family sponsor a Compassion Child as well. And for me personally, one of the highlights of last year, and Jack, I know you remember this as well, had the opportunity to travel with Jack, several others from Compassion, as we were doing work around the world to focus on employee engagement, which Compassion is a 5th time Great Workplace winner from within Gallup. So lots to be proud of there. But had the opportunity to travel around the world and spent time with Jack, and his wife Marie was with in Bangkok, Thailand. We actually had the opportunity to spend some time in one of the slums there and see up close what Compassion gets to do, just working with helping children in need. And so powerful mission, powerful organization. You've done a lot to kind of use strengths to live out the mission of the organization. Jack, we're excited to have you on today's Call to Coach.
Thank you, Jillian. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, Jack, I know I alluded to the work that you actually do within Compassion, but let's start from a personal perspective today from those listening in, and then we'll kind of work our way toward understanding, what you actually do from an organizational perspective as well. But give us a little insight into just what your role entails within Compassion.
Well, I'm even going to roll it back a little further, Jillian. It was about 20 years ago, last month, that my wife and I were invited to Compassion International to apply for a job within human resources. I was working for a large financial services company on the East Coast, and I had just been promoted to their director of diversity program. Here's this middle-aged, dumpy white guy who's running the diversity program, right? But we came out here just on a lark, just to see what it would be like. And we both fell in love with the organization. And at that point in time, I just really felt like I wanted to become part of this team. So I started out in human resources and learning and developing those kinds of things. Today, my role, and you mentioned it, it's the senior leadership and engagement consultant. And I work with strengths, I work with executive coaching, the employee engagement process. It's been quite a journey, 20 years almost now with Compassion, and it's been just a marvelous kind of an experience. Being able to travel around, meet so many different people around the world is just a real blessing.
Wonderful. Well, and Jack, I think it was in 2009 that you actually officially became a Gallup certified strengths coach. Do you mind sharing just a little about your own personal journey as a strengths coach and how that's kind of evolved within your work at Compassion as well?
Sure. And it's up close and personal. So I'm going to share a story that I think I shared with you before, but without getting too funny, I've got a number of scars on the side of my face from an automobile accident when I was 17 years old. And my number one strength is empathy. But I will tell you that the experience I had back then with the accident really, for me personally, I knew I kind of could understand people, but I remember one time, Jillian, standing on a train not long after the surgery to repair some of the damage to the face. And I remember there were no seats. I was standing up and looking down the aisleway of the train. And I will tell you, it was the strangest experience having everybody look at me. Because at that point in time, the face was puffy, a lot of disfigurement and so forth. And immediately they averted their eyes. And I will tell you that I got such a lesson in empathy. I mean, I had it based on, I was pretty good at the beginning, my wiring, but I understood really what it was like to be different at that particular point in time. It really did a lot for me. It was, like you said, in 2009 that through the faith division, I had an opportunity to be certified. We were working with employee engagement, and our consultant had offered this opportunity to tag along with another faith-based group, Roman Catholic Church, who were doing some fantastic things with engagement and strength. So within a short period of time, myself and a couple others were invited to participate, received certification then, and then began the journey of coaching throughout Compassion.
Yeah, that's incredible. And Jack, I thank you for sharing that story too. And just to mention, we heard your top strength there, empathy, but you come with empathy, connectedness, intellection, developer, relator, a lot of relationship building talents. And I think you see that in just how you lead and how you work within Compassion too. I know with Compassion, we've alluded to this already, but it's a very mission-centric organization. And when you think about from a strengths coach perspective, when you think about kind of aiming that work at that broader mission, can you just share with us some ways that you've intentionally done that, or maybe some moments that stick out to you where you've been able to use that to kind of help further the mission of Compassion?
Sure, Julie. There's an awful lot of talk, a lot has been written and talked about in terms of finding one's purpose. There's a YouTube video by a comedian named Michael Jr. that I would encourage anybody just to take a look at. It's only about 3 minutes long, but it's called Know Your Why. So at Compassion, and you know this, my friend, our best scoring question on the engagement survey has to do with mission and purpose. We typically score 99% plus because people who come to the organization, and if they stay, they really have a sense of what their purpose is. And the idea of knowing your why, and in my case, my why is really to reach out to other people to help nurture and facilitate growth in their lives. I don't work with any children. None of us, or very few of us here in the headquarters building in Colorado Springs work with kids. And early on in my time with Compassion, along with the mission, I got this real sense from God that he was saying to me, feed my sheep. I didn't quite know what that meant, but then the more I thought about it, I then began to think, feed my sheep so they can feed my lambs. So in a sense, we here at the corporate office really pour ourselves into the lives of our coworkers, the people who actually do work directly with the children. And there is this incredible sense of purpose and mission. What's great about strengths, and you know this, is that it allows you to put a handle on it, to put a label on it, to be able to talk about things. Light bulb come on when I'm coaching somebody. When they all of a sudden get an understanding of why they feel as they do, why they act as they do. A short short story, and I know my wife might be watching this one day, so I'm going to take a risk here and tell you that, we all know that in the Western world, when it comes to weddings, it's typical for the ceremony to be held and then off to the reception. And then maybe midway, 3/4 of the way through the reception, it's typical where the bride and the groom speed off, quietly. No lie, the janitorial staff asked us to leave because we were like almost the last ones there. My sweetheart wife wanted to dance with all of my relatives and get to know them because her number one strength is woo. And quite honestly, I thought that was so goofy. And yet, years later, understanding and appreciating her strengths of woo and maximizer, I began to understand, first of all, what a delight it's been to have her in my life. We complement each other very, very well. But back to the point, having this language of strengths just helps me to understand myself better, my colleagues, and my incredible family. Around the world, one of the things that strengths has enabled us to do is to, again, put a language around it, where in some of the cultures we work within, I'm thinking Asian, Africa, Latin America as well, there is sometimes this real hierarchical mindset, power distance, they sometimes call that. Me boss, you subordinate. Strengths has actually allowed us to kind of level the playing field in a lot of different ways. And one of the beautiful things I've seen is where a country director, let's say I'm thinking one in particular, I won't name that person, but his growth has been phenomenal through strengths. He was earlier seen as a very, I wouldn't say dictatorial, if you can be a benevolent dictator, maybe that would be how someone might describe him. But he began to really own the fact that God had wired him in certain ways, and he had wired his staff in other ways. He actually began to allow more and more of his staff to have a role in the operations of the office. In the old days, the whole idea of a manager was to plan and organize and direct and control. And today's mindset is more, I think, biblical in the sense of servant leadership. The idea being that if I'm a leader of a team, my goal is to speak into you as a team member and to understand you well enough that I can help to really maximize all those things that you do. And again, at Compassion, I see that happening a great deal.
Yeah. And Jack, I want to just reinforce a couple things I think you're mentioning there too. And one is kind of this idea of almost strengths as a bit of an equalizer, right? So it's, and I still remember for those of us who listened and learned so much from Kurt Liesfeld back in the day, but his last blog post was about the level of humility that strengths takes, right? And just this understanding that someone brings something different to the table than I do. And I think you're alluding to something that's powerful, especially in an intercultural environment like Compassion, right? Where you get to have a bit of a language that kind of helps you articulate and see what each person brings to the table. And just to make a couple other connections here too, I think, when you're alluding to even your work within the corporate office, I think some of what we're hearing is what we know from a Gallup perspective, which is employee engagement drives customer engagement, right? And so as you are kind of helping to create a great workplace, give people the tools that they need to be great managers, it has this ripple effect then on, in this case, your customers are, your sponsors, your sponsees, the children who you're impacting. And that, I think, is kind of this way of bringing everything together to help support that mission and what you're doing. So that's really neat to get to hear. And thank you. Jack did the video that you alluded to. I know you sent me that clip the other day, and it's powerful. They have the short little clip on there where there's a gentleman asked to sing Amazing Grace, and he sings it once. And then he's given this whole story on like why he sings it. And he just sings it so powerful when he's got the why behind it. So, for you being able to bring that back to the why, how about for you personally, Jack, when you think about just from a personal mission standpoint, how does strengths kind of give you insight into living your personal mission?
I look at it this way, Jillian, and you mentioned Kurt Liesfeld, and what a man, former colleague of yours at Gallup, absolute expert at strengths. He challenged me one time as a coach. He challenged me, he said, Jack, what's the opposite of arrogance? And I said, humility. And he goes, no, it's not. The opposite of arrogance, he said, is ignorance. I said, what? He said, arrogance says, I know everything. And I know that I know everything. Ignorance doesn't even know what you don't know. Humility is that place in the center where you realize you need other people. You know, you're gifted. Jillian, there are certain things I can run circles around you in, and there's certain things you can leave me in the dust with. And that's this whole concept from Scripture about the body of Christ, that we're not designed to be well-rounded. No one is. We're designed to plug and play, as it were, within community. So from my perspective, long answer to your question in terms of my own journey and how strengths have helped me, making that realization that, number one, I have to be able to tell people what I'm good at, what my strengths are. All employees do. Because when you do that, you begin to understand what you can do and how much you need to rely on other people. And actually, in my own strengths coach journey, that's very powerful for me. I don't have all the answers. In fact, I learn so much usually from my coachees, more so than I do. One of the things that, and my mind's kind of racing on a couple of different thoughts, but yeah. I shared this with you not all that long ago. I saw an interview, Watson, who played the role of Belle in Disney's live version or human version, as it were, of Beauty and the Beast. And she was asked, when you think about Belle, why was she so successful? And she said something I thought was pretty amazing. She said, Belle was able to use her superpower. And the interviewer said, what superpower? What superpower? And she said, empathy. Her ability to empathize with the creature and to dig deeper than the outer appearances was pretty magnificent. And for me, that helps me to be kind of connected and have success here. It's really this combination for me of empathy and connectedness that I think allows me to be pretty successful. One of the things, you know, it's funny, when I love the insight, an action planning guide that the Gallup produces. And many people don't realize how that's customized through algorithms, which presents to you a description of your empathy that takes into account all the other strengths. And the same for any of the top 5. I love seeing my connectedness, because the way it plays out for me is that there's only one line in that paragraph that really resonated. And that line said something like, you love to serve as a bridge builder between people. And I love doing that here at Compassion. I serve on the new hire orientation onboarding team, and I have a presentation that I do. And one of the things I love, Jillian, about doing that is that I'll see somebody or I'll hear them talking and I'll go, I need to connect them with Sally. I need to let them have coffee with Bill. I love doing that and then getting out of the way. So again, for me, that the use of my superpower, as it were, that combination of empathy and connectedness. This is the most fun job in the world, as far as I'm concerned. You know, to be able to live out your passion, to be able to actually do things that you believe make a difference, and to get that feedback from people. Feedback feels good, of course, but to know that it's actually working, and that people's lives are being touched, and by God's grace, the kids too. So,
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you for sharing, Jack. And you know, I want to hit on just a couple things from what you just shared there too, before we take this to kind of understanding, you know, what you're doing at an organizational perspective. First is, I want to just kind of insert a question here that I think you brought up. You know, we recognize the fact that an organization like Compassion is a faith-based organization, a Christ-centered organization. And I think from some of our coaches or individuals who are working with faith-based organizations, this question kind of comes up around, you know, how do you think about strengths from kind of that lens, or how does that mesh with things like spiritual gifts and things like that? And I know I've seen you actually present on some different thoughts with this. I'm just curious if you would be able to just share some of your own thinking in that area before we kind of look at what you've actually done across the organization, just for folks who are maybe asking that same question.
Sure. Our approach to strengths here at Compassion is really not an overlay, a spiritual overlay on a humanistic process. I was told that Don Clifton was a man of faith, and that he really truly believed that strengths was really getting at the heart of how God wired you. And whether you acknowledge that or not, it was a tool that was not simply, in his mind, a secular tool, but one that was actually very holistic and equalizing in a sense. At Compassion, one of the things that enables us to do, I mentioned this whole idea of humility. the more you understand strengths, I think, the more you understand what you're great at and what you're not so good at. And worldwide, that's actually beginning to happen a lot. People are beginning to understand this concept and to be able to deploy their strengths in a way that's, sometimes I think in Western Christianity, maybe all of Christianity, maybe all of faith-based organizations, there's this misguided sense of humility. I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy. But in Scripture, you see things like, don't hide your light under a bushel basket, let it shine forth. And quite honestly, the more you do that, the more effective you and your team are. So again, being able to see that organizationally and seeing improvements in even engagement scores, because you see that actually coming into play, people having conversations with one another, people having fun around these kinds of concepts.
That's great. That's great. And with that, I wanted to let's go ahead and just kind of look at what you've done across the organization too. So, for those who are thinking about, working within the context of a faith-based nonprofit, and what does it actually look like when you think about that from a strengths perspective, having the infrastructure to kind of support a strengths-based environment? Do you mind just sharing a little bit about, what
Sure.
you have done and what you are doing? Because I know we've got several things coming up as well,
Yep.
but within compassion in that area.
Sure. Jillian, I wish we could have done a more intentional, focused rollout of strengths and strengths philosophy over the years. But quite honestly, what we've experienced in about the 8 or 9 years that we've been really involved with strengths is sort of pockets of excellence, meaning you'll find a regional vice president or a country director. And by the way, just a little bit of structure for anybody listening in. We have about 3,000 employees worldwide. About 65% of them are based outside of the US. Compassion's belief was within a country office structure, and we have 28 of them around the world, that it has to be managed, run, and operated by nationals, not an expatriate from the United States who goes in there, who better to understand the people and the context than someone who actually lives there. So the decision, unfortunately, was thwarted a couple times with being able to do some top-down rollout. But what happened was that almost on a stealth basis, people would find out about this, or they would talk to me about opportunities. And I remember we have 3 regional vice presidents, all of them amazing. And each one of them at different times said, hey, Jack, if I pay for it, will you come over and present at the regional conference about strengths? And I've had the chance to do that in all 3 of the regions. So what's happened? And then all of a sudden I'll get a call from a HR specialist, let's say in Bolivia, who will say, Jack, we've decided we're going to do strengths. I need 73 codes. Okay. That's kind of the way it's organically grown throughout the organization. And you're aware of this. One of the things that Gallup is now helping us to do is to build a consolidated database of employee strengths. Compassion believes very strongly in the dignity and the value of people. And we act, even though Gallup said, why don't you ask everybody, and if they don't want to become part of the database, let us know and they won't be in it. Our leadership said, no, we want it in reverse. We want Jillian, we want Jack to actually have to pull the lever, push the voting button that says, yes, I'm in. And of those 3,000 employees, there's about 1,800 who have currently taken the instrument. These people were invited to say yes or no. And as of today, I think we're about 1,000 responses, and less than 3% have said no. And we truly honor and respect someone's desire not to be included. But at the same time, I'm celebrating the fact that, 96, 97% of the people are all in on this. And that is really going to propel the whole movement. I pretty much was the Lone Ranger for a long time in this regard. But little by little, I'm finding out there are people who are becoming certified on their own. There's a woman who works in the Philippines who just recently was certified through the Gallup agency, I think, in Asia. I am delighted. I mean, that's the best thing I could possibly hope for, this sharing, this collaboration that's going on. Pretty wonderful. I'm so delighted to be a part of it.
Well, and I know we've actually got coming up, we'll be certifying some additional strengths coaches within Compassion too, and so just excited to kind of see how that fuels things. And Jack, I think you might have just started a name for a new movement, the Stealth Strengths Movement. You mentioned folks kind of, this upswell that you can have within an organization, so it can be a little stealthy sometimes, but there is something a bit viral about people getting the opportunity to identify and talk about their natural strengths. And you've alluded to the fact that obviously intercultural organization here. You're working across a lot of different groups. I mean, we were in Ghana, West Africa, and then Thailand last year, and just working with those two different audiences back to back, we saw we had to customize our approach. And you're a pro at this. You've been doing this for a long time. When you think about that from a strengths perspective, how do you see strengths kind of playing out in this intercultural environment that Compassion has, and any thoughts or tips that you would have for kind of navigating strengths from that intercultural perspective?
Okay. Well, one of the things that has just dawned on me a great deal, there are some cultures that very much value education. All of them do, but certain cultures more so than others. I'd say Africa and Asia in particular. That certificate, that certification, the fact that they could participate in a strengths workshop is just such a delightful thing to them. But I always have to caution them that I've learned more and more that the language of strengths is literally that. It's a language. So how silly it would be for me to say to someone, I'm going to invite you to do a 2-hour presentation, and it's going to be about Spanish. Now, you don't speak Spanish now, but after 2 hours, you're going to get a good handle on what Spanish is all about. Well, that's kind of silly. But you would get the fundamentals. Maybe you'd understand a little bit about the verb to be or something like that. But strengths are the same way. And I find this interculturally a lot. Some people think, oh, I went through that. I know my top strengths. I'm ready to roll. No, not so fast. I know so much more today, 8 years after being certified, than I did 5 years ago, than I did 8 years ago. Learning more and more and becoming more and more fluent within strengths. Interculturally, I would say that sometimes there's this idea of being a little bit too deliberate, directive. For example, I have achiever. I don't have achiever, but somebody might say, I have achiever. And I say, so what?
I have achiever number one. Okay. It's number one in our database too, so I'm guessing a lot of folks listening in have it.
Yeah, one of the things. No, I love that. What do we call that? Strengths envy, right? I envy that. But one of the things I learned, and again, our dear brother Kurt Leesfield taught me this. He knew me pretty well by this coaching session that he and I were engaged in, and he said, how do you want to use your strengths? What do you want to become more effective at? I said, Kurt, 4 of my top 5 strengths are in the relationship domain. My number 34 is focus. And I go, I need to be able to sit down and to actually write curriculum. I need to figure out ways to do that. He said, let me tell you what you need to do, Jack. He said, I want you to think for a couple minutes about the organization. You have empathy, you had connectedness, developer, relator. I want you to think about the value of the things you produce. He said, do people use them? Do they get value from them? And I said, yeah, I know they do. He said, what I want you to do is to think about the outcome. Use your empathy, use your connectedness to become the driver that helps me to get some things done. Interculturally and around the world, that's really one of my biggest joys, is actually helping people to not only leverage their top 5, let's say, or the top 8, what have you, but to be able to leverage them to achieve other things that they don't think they can do. I shared a story with you, and forgive me if this goes on a little bit, but I was at the Colorado Springs airport about 5 years ago. And you know how that works. Just like Disney World, the elastic straps, and people are going up and down and up and down. And I'm about halfway through the line, and I happen to notice a young girl way over to the left, and she's butting in line. She is just butting her way through the line. And I'm thinking she's probably trying to get to a friend or to a family member. I didn't think much of it. But as she got closer and she was coming in the opposite direction from where I was headed, in that part of the line, I could see that she was crying. And I looked at her, I said, what's wrong? She said, my plane leaves in 5 minutes. I said, you mean your plane boards in 5 minutes? She said, no, it leaves. And I said, let me see your boarding pass. And I, kind of reached over the elastic and looked at it. And yeah, her plane was scheduled to depart in 5 minutes. We were at least a half an hour away from getting to the front of the line. I dropped my backpack and I picked up the elastic band and grabbed her by the shoulder. and said, follow me. And I just pulled her under and I started yelling ahead. There were probably 20, 25 people in front of me. Started yelling ahead, get out of her way, get out of her way. Her plane leaves. She's got to get out. She's got to get onto the plane. Her plane's leaving. And I joked, but it was like Moses in the Red Sea. I mean, the people just kind of parted and they let us go. The TSA agent at the front, and sometimes people, make jokes about those staff members, but they know what they're doing. And the gentleman who was the agent looked at us coming through, and he said to the 3 or 4 remaining people, get out of her way. He grabbed her boarding pass, didn't even look at it, stamped it, and then yelled to his colleagues at the belt, the other security point. He said, let this girl up front now, her plane's leaving. And she was still weeping, and she just whispered thank you as she just ran ahead. And I'm standing there at the front. I'm just thinking, like, I just wish I had brought my backpack with me, But anyway, ended up going back about 20 feet. And it was really a momentous moment for me. And I say this very truthfully. There's no boasting in this at all. I'm not wired in command and execution at all, but it was my empathy and my connectedness. I could look at this young lady who was about the age of my youngest daughter, and I knew what she was going through. And with connectedness, I knew that if I could possibly convince the people or even just communicate to them what the issue was, that they'd comply, and lo and behold, they did. So again, that's interculturally, sometimes people think, these are my top 5, and if I don't have this, I don't have it. And I'd love to be able to kind of unpack stories like that will just enable them to see, hey, I can leverage my top 5, but I can also leverage them to accomplish great things may not be so inclined to do.
And I love that story, Jack. I still remember when you shared that one, and it stuck with me. In fact, I think I've even shared it with other folks. And, for those coaches who are listening in, and you think about, for those who've been through certification, we talk about the different leadership domains that strengths fall into, and executing versus relationship building. And we talk about the fact that it's very short walls between those domains. And so I think there's a story like what you just shared says, it's where you're getting your energy from. It's where you're naturally wired, but your empathy still allows you to do things. It is in a sense then having the same outcomes as some of those execution strengths, but it's getting there a different way. And that strengths-based approach is kind of honoring that different way of getting there. And I love how you kind of brought that back even to thinking about this from an intercultural perspective, because even from a Gallup perspective, as we look at strengths, that there's no cultural differences between achiever is achiever no matter where you go. Empathy is empathy no matter where you go. They may be perceived differently within different cultures, but there is something kind of fundamental that just unites us together as human beings as we kind of look at this common language that's universal. And so thanks for kind of bringing that up and talking about that language with that. One last question.
Can I ask
yeah.
a question? And I don't know if you're comfortable sharing this, but
sure.
you shared a story of a colleague within your office who was tasked, I think, with going out and meeting a great number of people, and she was thinking she didn't have those kind of relator woo kinds of things.
Yeah.
But tell me again, how did she actually get that job done using her other strengths?
Oh, I love this, Jim. This is a new twist on Called to Coach. This is like interview the the host. You know what? It's a great story with this, and I think it kind of reinforces the whole point that you're making, Jack, which is just that that our strengths, if we're looking at, we can accomplish the same outcome, but with different ways of getting there. And this was a colleague of mine who has high context, very low woo, and so unlike your wife Marie, she doesn't love being in a room and like meeting a bunch of people all at once. And part of her onboarding within Gallup, so as you come within Gallup, we're a pretty relational culture, and you get to know people over time. And so part of the expectation is that you're setting up some one-on-one connections with folks and all of this. And so this colleague was just like, oh my goodness, that sounds draining, right? Just having to connect with all of these people. And as soon as, similar to the story that you just shared with us, as soon as she reframed that in light of, what what do I have that's going to help me get to that same outcome? I have context. I love learning about people's history. I love learning about the history of an organization. I'm going to put together some questions that I'm just going to ask people in a one-on-one context to start to learn more about the history. And through that, she actually ended up building relationships through connecting over that context. So I think stories like that, stories like what you shared, just remind us as coaches about the power of helping people see how, you know, you can use different strengths to get to the same outcome.
Absolutely.
And it honors allowing people to do that.
Absolutely.
So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share that as well.
Thanks for letting me change roles.
Oh, that's fantastic. So one final question from an advice perspective, and then we'll check in with Jim here too and see if we've got anything coming in over chat or questions from folks who are listening in live. But if I think about, I think it's common for us to get questions within the coaching community about advice for working with a faith-based organization, a nonprofit. What advice would you have sitting in one from a strengths perspective? You know, what advice would you give folks with coaching or working with faith-based or nonprofit organizations?
That's a great question. The first thing I would suggest, you know, Gallup has a lot of great resources, but one of the best resources I've ever come across was the book Living Your Strengths by Kurt Leesfield and Al Weinsman. It really took me on quantum leaps in terms of my understanding of strengths, really from a faith perspective. So any coach who might want to try to dialogue with and engage with a faith-based organization would be well advised to get a hold of that book and to really read it deeply and to think about it. Now, it's presented within a Christian context, but quite honestly, whether it's Christian or any other kind of faith-based denomination or group, I think it's very, very powerful. It really takes away, kind of peels back the secular feel that this instrument could actually have and really presents it in a way that would be very helpful. I think for a coach, let's say, who wanted to approach a larger faith-based community, this will give you some more talking points. This will give you a great deal more language. You know, in the introduction, Jillian, you spoke about within a Christian context, there are conversations around, well, what are your spiritual gifts? And oftentimes, well, people say, well, how's that different from strengths? This book actually unpacks that a great deal. They're not in conflict at all. They really complement one another. Other suggestions I'd have is to, again, back to that thought of humility, the idea that God, in my belief system, wants me to operate from a position of strengths. So if I were talking, let's say, to a pastor, if I may, I might be talking to him or her about what strengths can do for their congregation, for members of their congregation, to give them greater insights into the way that God is wired and created them. It is just an incredible tool just to help with understanding. I've been doing this kind of work for about 40 years, quite honestly, and familiar with most instruments. And I joke to people, I say, hey, I'm a Capricorn. I hope I'm not offending anybody, but I smile and I say, well, so what? I mean, what does that do? I mean, forget the theology behind that, but what strengths does is give you something that you can actually leverage. You as a faith-based community leader, along with a coach who could kind of bring you along to help educate you, your staff, your congregation, you're going to create a much more powerful, much more impactful community. And that's really what these good folks strive for. And I just think that Gallup's only scratched the surface in terms of the depth that this could go to.
Yeah, fantastic. And fantastic reminders. I mean, even if I just bring this back to what our coaches talk about with the simple name, claim, and name model around strengths, right? And it's, you know, to your point, with kind of this universal language of understanding fundamentally how we are wired as humans. And that's a bit of that naming piece, right? And claiming is kind of what we get to do as coaches and working with people. And I think the power of kind of seeing this come to life in a nonprofit is just seeing how that aim so directly connects with a mission orientation, right? And how you're kind of helping people connect who they are to what they feel called, to use your words earlier, and their why, their personal why, and the why of the organization. That I think is powerful for us to get to see. So thank you, Jack, for just sharing some of your own story with us. Jim, let's check in and see if we got any questions that have come in.
Yeah, I'm gonna give them a second to bring some questions in. But Jack, I've got a question for you. I get a lot of questions from coaches, especially in the nonprofit space, around the financial expense of this, and how is that managed, and how is it budgeted, and how does that work? I think sometimes we, with nonprofits, we just make the assumption they can't afford anything, but certainly Compassion has made that development of their people a priority. You also you talked about little by little, and that requires, you're a coach, and little by little requires patience, right? You're either paying for it on one end or paying for it on the other, and you're paying for it in patience as you wait for people to kind of make that decision. So one, how are you guys, how do you on the back end, how's that handled financially? How do you guys prioritize that? And then two, how do you, what are some tips for being a coach and being patient and waiting for people to come? Because you're not mandating it, and it's not like everybody's got to do it. Right. So how do you do that? So two questions there.
Okay. Yeah, two questions. You know, regardless, faith-based or secular organization, one of the first parts of the budget to be trimmed, of course, is training and development. It's not just an issue with nonprofits, but it's for everyone. We are so fortunate here at Compassion to have a president who's been with us for 4 years. Jimmy Mulatto is his name. He formerly worked at Willow Creek churches in Chicago and the Willow Creek Association. But for 20 years, Jim, his entire life was built around training and development and developing people.
And in fact, as a side note there, Jack, if anyone, I think he actually organized all the global leadership summits that took place. Is that right?
Exactly right. He was the president of that particular organization under Bill Hybels and the board there. But we are so lucky to have a man like this at the helm, because he so believes in leadership development. So again, that's sort of given us a little bit of an edge up. In terms of how to position this, the more, you know, Jimmy is totally sold on strengths. He will talk about his top 10 every chance he gets, which is great. And in his life, most of them are in the execution domain. Here's a man who not only led this great organization, but he was an Olympian. He actually served on the El Salvador Olympic team back in the 80s. He got his master's from Harvard. Totally well-rounded. But he'll be the first to say that his strengths are more in the execution realm, and he has a harder time relationally. But the reality is he's an incredibly relational guy. And when he was sharing this one time at a meeting, I just put my hand up and said, "Hey, Jimmy, you have competition as your number two. I bet you use that in order to deepen relationships." And he kind of thought about it and tilted his head up and said, "Yeah, he doesn't want to lose. He wants to make this relationship work." So that's the kind of thing that gives him the drive and the energy. Jim, in terms of the funding, the way Compassion's model works, 1 year budget, and there are a lot of freedom within pockets to be able to spend that. So the regional vice presidents of Asia and Africa and Latin America, they have a large budget, so they could actually, and they did, they would bring me in or certify some of their people by codes and that kind of a thing. In terms of marketing, one of the things I do, again, I serve at orientation, and part of our message then over this 3.5 day experience is to talk about strengths. They're given a Strength Finder code and book first day, and by the time I get to them on the last day, many of them have taken it. We don't, they're getting fire hose with all kinds of information, but I always say to them, kind of put on a little plug for strengths and offer them the opportunity to have a conversation. And many of them do. So in a sense of building the business, that's sort of an easy way that I get to do that. One of the exciting things at Compassion, again, we're nonprofit, faith-based, and yes, poor, no, by God's grace, we're surviving and doing quite well. Next year, between January and December, we are going to launch the most ambitious leadership development initiative I've seen in my 20 years. I have a director who joined us from Eastern University, a PhD in learning and development. He was the former dean of the leadership development department of that college. And she's convinced the organization to make the necessary investment in a process where we're going to train the 550 managers around the world. We're going to put them into cohort groups of 30 and invite them to a retreat somewhere in another country. And for that 1 week, that's great. That's kind of how we've done it in the past. But the beautiful difference this time is that 1 week retreat is going to be followed by 4 to 6 months of online engagement with your cohort and with groups of 3, facilitated by someone else. So again, the Compassion's sold on the whole idea of development, and I'm working with Beth, my boss, in crafting some of the content, and you better believe strengths is going to play a big part in it. Really making sure that managers and leaders not only understand their own strengths, but have the wherewithal and the tools perhaps to be able to speak into the lives of their people. Long answer, Jim, to your question. I'm able to sell these things, quite honestly, not only because of the utility they bring, because of the passion other people bring in as they speak into us, but again, fortunate enough to have leaders here that are sold out on it.
Jillian, from a Gallup perspective, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. Well, and I can kind of reinforce a few things that Jack, I think you're mentioning, because even when you think about, I think one of the most common questions we get is kind of how to roll out strengths within different organizations, and there's multiple ways to do that. The same way that you can have multiple strengths kind of get to the same outcome, you can have multiple ways to become a strengths-based organization. And like you said, Jack, you know, in an ideal world, and we've had other clients that we've worked with where we've done a much more kind of formal, robust rollout, right, of strengths.
Right.
And to your point, going back to our kind of new, you know, stealthy strengths movement that we have going on, there are other organizations where it becomes a bit more grassroots movement. And I think, you know, maybe it's particularly in a faith context, you've almost got a little of kind of both of these things going on at the same time. Because to your point, if you've got leadership supporting this and saying, we understand that investing in our people is actually going to have an incredible ripple effect for living out our mission, then there is some kind of backbone, if you will, to investment in your people. But yet you're also kind of allowing for, okay, if there's some regions that maybe from a readiness perspective, you've got some pockets that are just saying, hey, we've got some natural movement around this. We want to have some conversations. Fueling that and providing resources for that can be a powerful thing too, and having a bit more of kind of the grassroots upward movement, if you will. I think one thing I do want to point out from what Jack just mentioned here is, you know, when you really think about living out a strengths-based culture, there's a lot of power in connecting that to existing DNA within an organization, right? And so it's not just, and for me, across all the organizations that I get to kind of look into and work with, from, you know, nonprofits to global consulting firms, and when I look at what the best are doing differently, it's not some add-on. It's really kind of integrating it into the way we think about who we are as people, how we engage our employees, how we equip our managers. And so even your last example that you just gave there, Jack, with baking this into kind of your equipping leaders program, that's not just a one-time touch point, but it's really kind of a multiple point journey from a learning perspective, and helping people, you know, to think about, okay, who am I? Who are the people I'm managing and interacting with? That can be incredibly powerful as you think about growing leaders. And so for coaches listening in, if you're working with different organizations, spend some time kind of understanding what's the existing DNA for how leaders are growing, for how people are onboarded, for how training takes place, and what's then some of those integration points like you're mentioning, Jack, if we're thinking about kind of reinforcing that with how we grow talent, how we're engaging talent within our organization.
And it's like you guys were reading David's mind. So David in the chat room had just asked this question about how do you keep this from being a one-off, you know, and to be honest, we see this in organizations. It doesn't have to be nonprofit, doesn't have to be faith-based. We see a lot of small, medium, large organizations that make it a one-off. You guys, Jillian, you said add it to the DNA. I think, Jack, you said earlier, you talked about the spiritual gift inventory, which is really just a talent assessment in a lot of ways. Of what do you enjoy? What do you like? What do you feel like you're good at from a skills standpoint, right? What have you had success with in the past? That's great. How do you, so you guys kind of answer that question, but Jack, I want to say, do you guys calculate your investment with any ROI in the sense of how is it moving the needle there? And how do you know it's moving the needle at Compassion? Because it's easy to say, wow, we should be strengths-based, but sometimes executives want to know it's moving the needle. So how are you guys measuring that?
Well, to be honest with you, on that particular point, Jim, the idea of measuring ROI on strengths, we've not done a very good job. But we're fortunate to be able to have access to the employee engagement survey. And we've administered it 9 times in partnership with Gallup. We've seen our engagement index company-wide just increased dramatically. And as you know, strengths is a component of that with the question, I get to do what I do best every day. And to see the increases in that question from maybe a team that really people didn't feel that way, to all of a sudden now they're growing exponentially. One of the things I really like too is with leaders that they're beginning to like open their hands a little bit more in terms of no longer do a lot of our leaders think I have to be in charge. I have to run this monthly meeting. They're beginning to see the strengths and the interests that other people have, and they're beginning to offload that, to delegate it. And in doing so, they're performing an incredibly important development task for their people. Kind of a beautiful thing to see. In terms of keeping it going, I do resonate with that. One of the things we've created this network of employee engagement champions. Jillian and our friend Jeremy Petrosini were the facilitators for that here in the US and around the world. So we've got this cadre of people that we actually bring alongside of managers to be able to reinforce things. So in terms of, the original training, opportunities for individual coaching, and then some reminders from me, just kind of blast out emails type of thing. And then this, like I say, cadre of 90 people that speak into that as well, just to kind of keep the ball rolling and the momentum going forward.
Jackie, you just gave, Jillian, I'll give you a chance here in just a second. You just gave a clinic, by the way, on how the two of you just gave a clinic, right? I mean, embedded in the DNA, right? Get other people involved, get champions involved in areas of both strengths and engagement, have support from the highest levels, right? I mean, all those things that you just said, we hear that all the time. By the way, we hear that in the enterprise, just like we hear it in the nonprofits. And I think sometimes we think, well, the nonprofits are a different animal, and they really aren't. It's still people, and they still have feelings, and they still have strengths, right? Jillian,
Exactly.
you do this all the time.
That's such a great point, Jim, just to make those interconnections between, how organizations are run, whether you're a nonprofit, whether you're not a nonprofit, or a for-profit. And I was just going to add, to what Jack is alluding to here, and once again, from a Gallup science perspective, essentially what we're looking at is just kind of the additive effect of strengths and engagement focus, and so that connection point, and that is often where we look for ROI, right? Is how we know that when you're taking a strengths-based approach, that it becomes this kind of accelerant to creating an engaging culture, creating a great workplace. And so that is one of the things that we kind of look for and can help track. And to Jack's point, we see lift in drivers that help us kind of get a pulse on how a workplace is doing. And like I mentioned, Compassion is actually a 5th time Gallup Great Workplace Award winner. And I think a lot of that is because of some of this infrastructure, engagement champions, strengths work that's kind of supporting that, kind of all integrated in that approach as well.
Amen.
Jillian, we're at the end of our time. And so any final thoughts? And let's thank Jack for coming as well.
Oh, just thank you. I hope you've all enjoyed just getting to listen in. And Jack, you're just such an incredible human being, for one, and just such a privilege to get to spend time with you, and just inspired by the work that you do, inspired by I think just getting to talk with you. We feel your empathy, your connectedness, your intellection, your developer, your relator, and you're using those things to do powerful work within Compassion. So thank you for taking the time to meet with us and to share with us today.
Jillian, thank you. And again, thank you for the partnership and what you brought to this organization. And Jim, thank you for the opportunity really to be a part of this. I appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks from my side as well. Tons of fun to be able to talk about this. It's always this is the best part of my job, is that I get to see all of these great engagements that are going on around the world in different kinds of groups and different settings, whether it's in the enterprise or in nonprofit, whether it's in Asia or Europe or the United States. This is a global movement, and great to hear. Jack, thanks for taking the hour to come on and share with us today. I really, really appreciate it. We want to remind everyone to take full advantage of all the resources we have available at the Gallup Strength Center, just gallupstrengthcenter.com. Send us your questions or comments if you'd like to be a guest blogger. If you got something kind of locked up in your head you want to write down, we're looking for some original content. 400 to 600 words. It'll make it on our coach's blog. If we can get that you can get that to us, send it to us, coaching@gallup.com, and put guest blogger in the subject line, and we will consider that for the blog. You can also catch the recorded audio and video of this program as well as the past ones over on our coach's blog, and that's just, again, that place is coaching.gallup.com. If you're interested in becoming a Gallup Certified Strengths Coach, we talked about that a few times here today. You can see a complete list of all our courses that lead to that right on our courses page, we try not to make it too hard. Courses.gallup.com will get you there, or there's a contact form on the page and somebody will call you right back. If you are a certified strengths coach, or if you're not, we have a strength summit coming up here in Omaha, Nebraska here, July 17th, 18th, and 19th. It's not too late, although it's getting pretty close. We're less than a month away from seeing a lot of folks here. And so still time to sign up. Head out to CliftonStrengthsSummit.com if you'd like to join us there, and we'd love to see you here in July. If you found this helpful, we'd ask that you share it, and we'll thank everyone for joining us today. And with that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.